released on September 22nd of 2009 in North America and 3 days later in Europe. With it already being very successful in the East, the hype in the West was quite large. So much so that this was the next AAA MMO, being considered the WoW killer, one of many in a line back around the later 2000s and the early 2010s. The graphics were definitely the standing out factor for most, but with its dynamic of flying combat, the game looked to change how combat in PvP could be played, and elevated to another dimension. The combat is tab targeting, but it utilizes a nice combo and chain system so that the combat could flow better when attacking. And one of the other core features that NCSoft boasted about was the Abyss. That was where the PvPvE would go down. If you wanted to go into the Abyss, you better be prepared with friends, guildies, and allies, because not only will you have to kill the enemy faction, but also the NPCs that reside there. There were sieges and locations for taking as a way to gain currency for better gear, as well as some EXP, and it was to show off your dominance for your faction, your guild, and for yourself as a player. But not everything went to plan. Sure, everything sounded great on paper, and by the looks of the graphics, how could you not enjoy an MMO like this? Well, simply put, trying to play the game in the Abyss was a nightmare with how many people were actually playing the game, especially for those using lower end computers. Also, with Aion being an Eastern MMO, the Western market was not so privy to enjoying the grind to the max level, which would often require grinding mobs for hours on end on top of the questing. People, like myself, enjoyed the game for quite a while, but the grind turned many of us off. Flash forward years down the road, and updates continued to fill the game with content, as well as the switch to free to play. As many of the people who played the game still, and those who have played it in the past after it went free to play, you know what the microtransactions have done to the game. Yes, you can actually get access to a lot of the game for free, but NCSoft still has to turn a profit on their product, so the microtransactions have plagued the game for a while now. Nonetheless, I do jump back into the game every year or so to see what's new, and this time a good amount is, since the last time I played the game about a year and a half ago. Every time I jump back in, the nostalgia hits as I reminisce about the first time playing Aion, but this video was going to focus on the game in 2020. So I'm going to show off some of the questing and the leveling process, explain the current situation with the PvPvE and the Abyss, and what to do at endgame if you are someone who is looking to get into Aion. Aion has two different factions, the Ilios and the Asmodeans. One thing that I do wish would have changed by now is the fact that you are locked to one faction on a certain server. There are only 2 servers, which means if you do want to play the other faction, you're gonna have to choose the other server. That used to be a standard in MMOs about a decade ago, not really anymore. Okay, putting that aside though, in Aion there are 6 classes where at level 10, once you leave the starting zone, you will choose one of 2 primary classes that will go ahead and specify into a more defined role of your character. For the warrior, you're going to see me choose to go with the gladiator. The gladiator is more of like a two-handed, big-ass weapon holder, DPS kind of guy. The muse that I'm leveling, I decided to go with the vandal, who actually kills things with paint somehow, and my cleric, I chose the chanter. When I played back at launch, I played a chanter, and my alt was an assassin, but somehow I lost that account to a hacker, and then NCSoft decided to ban the account. So yeah, that was a sad day for me. But we're focusing on the now, and the now is far from where Aion was those many years ago, where the questing was far from more grindier and actually required a lot more from players. As you can see, each quest I complete gives pretty much a full level, and that goes even into the 20s, the 30s, and even into the 50s. It makes sense that now new players have to level up to level 80. They want players to be able to catch up quicker, which is understandable, but the zones that you used to level in have been changed, and you are going to level through less zones that are filled with a lot of very easy quests, and then it's another large zone and it's rinse and repeat. Back in the day, it was more zones and a slower process. Nonetheless, they help teach you the basics such as the class's skills, in-game titles, minions, and the flying process, and those who are trying to participate in dungeons, among the other pretty standard things that you find in MMOs when you are leveling up. Eventually you get out of the first zone and you get into the next one around the later 50s, and like I said, this is pretty much a rinse and repeat. Aion never had incredible quests, but the story was definitely more intriguing than most. With it having voice acted cutscenes, it was often filled with the lore of the story. Much like when I play other MMOs, I don't really follow the story, so I cannot tell you what it was about or how it has evolved. Just like much of what made Aion just so great in the beginning years has been taken away, and for me that is the variety of these zones, so the questing has become more bland. And although before it was far more grindier and took more time to get to the end game, I felt as if I was immersed in an MMO. Now I feel like I'm playing in an RPG, and I know the reason behind the zones changing has to do with the allure of the abyss being frozen over and those zones being destroyed with it or something like that, but it does seem like that happened because of how little the abyss and the lower level zones were being utilized with a smaller player base. A lot has changed in the years since release of Aion, and we're gonna get into that. They probably wanted to consolidate everything, and well, I did mention the abyss, so why don't we talk about the PvP, PvE, the PvPvE, and all things about that kind of correlating in Aion. As I said earlier, the Abyss, which was an integral part of Aion at launch, is now blocked off aside from there being a siege that players are able to participate in a couple days a week. The Abyss, as I had explained earlier in the video, was where PvP and PvE were smashed together like a bowl of mashed potatoes. Mashed potatoes that have the potential to be made exquisite. It's the recipe. On paper it sounds amazing, but when it's made, it never lives up to the expectations, because the oven that you use to bake them was just not really the right oven for the job. That job being the CryEngine. Yeah, it gave Aion a beautiful game, but it was never meant to handle the sheer mass amount of players on a screen within the Abyss. Years later, and now the Abyss is gone, unfortunately. Another integral piece gone from Aion. Well, not completely gone, because there are several sieges every week that go on, so the PvPvE continues a bit, but not the same way that they used to use the Abyss. When it comes to the more PvE focused content, there are dungeons, and dungeons will give you your high-end PvE gear. Like many other MMOs, there are separate sets for PvP and PvE, so players can choose a specific gear set when doing certain things in the game. As far as the rest of the PvP and the PvE goes, well, that's pretty much what it is, unfortunately. I queued for many different dungeons when I was playing on my Chanter and my Vandal, but I was never able to get into one, probably because people aren't really looking to do those while leveling up. It's quicker to do the questing. And the sieges, unfortunately, are also for level 80 characters, which at this point I do not have, sadly, so I did have to do some research of the state of it in 2020. The PvE back in the day in Aion, it was never the best, but it was pretty good. Nowadays, it's pretty standard. You do your dungeons, you do your sieges. It doesn't look like there's a whole lot of other things to do aside from that in the PvE and the PvP. As far as the PvPvE goes, that's a mouthful. It's just these sieges. There's not a whole lot left. The PvPvE was surrounded by the Abyss, and the Abyss is pretty much gone at this point. Aion has gone through tons of updates through the years, and what I, at several different times with years in between, miss so much about Aion are the old zones. But I understand why it has changed and why the lesser amount of quests are given to the player throughout the questing process. And not only that, but also the amount of requirements for each quest. The industry, especially in the West, does not enjoy a grindy game, which was what Aion was called when it was released. The game did so well in the East for years and years, but not so well in the West. With all of that being said, the game that people used to know is quite different, and that does happen with a lot of MMOs. The leveling process has been cut down a lot so that they can help players get to endgame quicker. There have been new updates that introduce new quests, new zones, and more content, but the game is very different. As someone who has played almost every MMO that has been released from 2008, from your AAA titles to your shitty free-to-play cash grabs, all the way up until this point, unfortunately Aion doesn't seem like a game in a strong point where I would recommend people to grind to endgame for it to pay off. Now don't get me wrong, the game is definitely one of the better free-to-play games, and you can experience a good amount of the game as a free-to-play player, unlike many other free-to-play AAA MMOs. The graphics are still amazing, and honestly, they still tend to awe me every time I jump back in. And although the combat is nothing extremely innovative, I still enjoy it a lot, and how they are able to utilize the chains and the combo system. Aion boasted about the flying at its inception, but it was never really able to utilize it well enough, and that is kind of still the case. It seems like they went even further from the fact that one of their core mechanics at release was the ability to fly, because now ground mounts are more apparent. It's funny because as most other MMOs progress and add in more content and zones, they introduce some sort of flying system into their game. But with Aion, they never really utilized it to their advantage, and they ended up degressing with their flying. As you can see from a previous Aion player, I miss what was from Aion. But also, as an MMO player for years, I understand that games evolve and that games need to turn a profit. In 2020, Aion in the West has changed a lot, and there are less people, but it is a game that can still be enjoyable. The game is still beautiful, there are still a lot of people who participate in the endgame sieges and those dungeons, as well as open world PvP, but it is far from the game that a lot of people used to know. And even so much so as when you played the game probably 2, 3, or 4 years ago. It does still get content updates, but I'm afraid that it's getting closer and closer to the game's maintenance mode with each update. If you're curious about the game's current state and you want to know if you should play it, well, I wouldn't say no, but just know that it has years under its belt and that it creeps closer and closer to a lesser population. What once was is not what is. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. This seemed kind of ranty after I had written it out, but it comes from the heart as a previous player and an MMO lover. I'm curious, are any of you guys still currently playing Aion? And if so, what region? Because I know that there are a good amount of people playing in the EU version, and I do believe that it's still pretty large over in the East, but not so much in the NA. Let me know what other MMOs and games I should check out, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.